Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Dead Man Walking by Sister Helen Prejean. This memoir was originally published back in 1993, and I listened to an audio edition of this. I did not actually read this edition. I listened to an audio edition that was read by Sister Helen herself, which was just fantastic because Sister Helen has this South Louisiana accent, and to hear this memoir read in her own voice was so cool. Dead Man Walking. This is been adapted into a fairly famous movie starring Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn from the 90s. I watched that movie back then. I haven't seen it since, but this chat is really only going to be about the book. And I decided to read this memoir. I don't read enough memoirs, and I'm always telling myself, go find some good memoirs. There are tons of them out there, and read more memoirs, and I never do. But as it happened, I just happened across this book in a private library that I have access to, and this one just caught my eye, and it was kind of just an impulse read, and I decided just to go ahead and get this read. And it was really moving in a lot of ways. Sister Helen is an amazing person, and we're going to get more into that here in a bit. But Dead Man Walking by Sister Helen Prejean. So as I mentioned, we're going to only talk about the book here, not the movie. But if you've seen the movie and you've not read the memoir, one of the main differences is there's only one prisoner in the movie. But in the book itself, actually, Sister Helen is the spiritual advisor to 2 death row inmates. So the story really basically starts in 1982 in January. Sister Helen is working in New Orleans in a place called Hope House. She's teaching high school dropouts, high school, equivalency education there. And she is approached by someone from a group called the Prison Coalition there in New Orleans. And she is asked to become a pen pal to a death row inmate in the state prison there in Louisiana, in Angola it's called. And she agrees to do this because she feels like it's along her mission that she has in life of sort of working with the poor and those in distress. And so she decides that she will accept to become this prisoner's pen pal. So she sets out and she writes him, and they exchange letters and things, really just in a kind of just friendly way. She's going into this, really naively. So she didn't have any experience in working with prisoners, much less the death penalty or death row inmates. But she sets out and becomes pen pals with this prisoner whose name is Patrick Sonier. So Patrick Sonier, along with his brother, was convicted of the abduction of a young couple from like a lover's lane, and they abducted the couple, they raped the girl, and then they killed them both. It was Patrick and his brother Eddie. Ultimately, Eddie, the brother, ended up getting a life sentence, and Patrick got the death penalty because he was figured to have been the one that actually pulled the trigger and committed the murders, although that was disputed, including later on even by his own brother Eddie. But nevertheless, that's how Patrick got wound up on death row, and his brother wound up with life. So the other prisoner later on in the book, she, after Patrick is ultimately executed, she becomes the spiritual advisor. Now, she started out as a pen pal with Patrick Sonier. She eventually goes to see him in prison there in Angola, for like a personal in-person visit. And then she ultimately becomes his spiritual advisor, which gives her a different access to him within the prison itself. So she then becomes his spiritual advisor all the way through until his final execution. Then the second sort of maybe third of the book is about a different prisoner whose name is Robert Willie. Robert Willie and his accomplice was convicted of an abduction of a young woman in Louisiana and brutally raped and murdered her as well. So neither one of these guys are really nice guys. They're really enemies to society, right? in the case of Patrick Sonier, there was a question of whether or not he had actually done the killing, but nevertheless, he had participated in this rape and murder. In the case of Robert Willie, he did, he has definitely blame. Plus, he's been in white supremacy groups and things like that. But nevertheless, Sister Helen, and in this book, it's just amazing how she's able to see the humanity in both of these prisoners. And it's really that thing about loving your enemy. Both of these prisoners are really enemies to society because they've done some horrible, terrible things, and yet she's able to see the humanity in them. And I thought that was one of the most powerful parts of this book. But just to talk about a bit about the injustice of the death penalty, I could spend this entire chat talking about that, because in the book, Sister Helen talks about this a lot as far as her arguments of why she's opposed to the death penalty as a system of punishment in the United States, or actually anywhere. She feels that it is morally wrong. But rather than spend all of our time talking about that, which we could, she makes very good arguments. I just thought I would hit a few of the more high points that I took away from it. Number one, the death penalty is very unevenly applied. It really depends. It falls mostly on the poor and the minorities. In the case of Louisiana, African Americans are far disproportionately represented in death row cases than are whites. Although in the case of Patrick Sonier and Robert Willie, they were both white prisoners, but nevertheless, that's really the minority. Most of the prisoners are black. You're more likely to get the death penalty, especially for a black person who kills a white person. There's an example in the book of where there was a young woman raped and murdered, whereas the perpetrators there were white and the victim was black, and that murderer did not get the death penalty. So it's very unevenly applied. And there's a system of gates. She explains this a lot, especially around Patrick Sonier, because the book really describes, this memoir really describes her efforts and others' efforts to try to get the courts, get the governor to look at his case, because there had been all sorts of things that hadn't been done quite as good as they could have been done. But as she explains in the book, like, the justice system is a system of gates. And once you pass through a certain gate, you can't really go back then and redo that. So even though there were mistakes made in earlier parts of his prosecution by his defense attorney, which often the defense attorneys in the case of poor people is, have provided, and these are people who are just working for free, and they're not necessarily the most experienced people, and so they therefore miss things. But if things are missed early on, they can't be remedied later on, and this came to impact Patrick Sonier quite a bit. And then she makes the point here, I believe this is actually from Camus. She talks about Camus, Albert Camus, the French philosopher who wrote a book about about capital punishment, or an essay rather, I think. I don't remember if it was a book or an essay, but nevertheless, the point was made that execution is a policy that imitates the violence it claims to abhor. So it kills in a kind of, we think of it as a very sanitary way, but it's actually a very kind of brutal way if you think about, and she points this out very well in the book. Another analogy she puts in the book, like, if you think about it this way, like, if there's a serial killer, someone who's known to have killed many, many, many people, and he has you prisoner, and he has you prisoner in a locked room, and he comes to see you, and he might be coming with news that he's going to let you go, or he might come and he's going to set the date of your death. I'm going to kill you on this date. But then he comes to you. I might come to you and change my mind at any time up to that point. That if we think of it, think of that serial killer as being society, being the government, who's killed many people, has people incarcerated, and actually does this to people. She uses that analogy of sort of the serial killer analogy of the death penalty. Another point about the injustice is about who killed this man. She asked this question sort of rhetorically. Who kills prisoners? Because it's so sanitized, it's hidden from the public nowadays. It's considered that it would brutalize the public if the public actually were able to see the executions. Although the public, in the past, it's been a source of public entertainment to see public executions. But is that the kind of society we want to have? Before I run out of time, I want to touch base on some of Sister Helen's compassion. There's a lot of talk here. She talks a lot about her interactions with the families of the victims and the families of the prisoners. She has a much compassion for them. The victims, the victims' families, and the prisoners' families. She has a lot of compassion for them. But the victims' families, she doesn't interact with them at first right away. She's going to this very naive, and it hurts their feelings that she's comforting the killer of their children and not them, right? And so they take offense to that. But she works through that with some of them and actually eventually starts a victims group or participates in victims groups. So... but her humility and also the guards, she has compassion. She thinks everybody that's involved in the prison, in the death of the prisoner, is actually complicit in it. She has this humility to her that she doesn't come across as superior or judgmental at all. So it's really quite beautiful. Finally, the final kind of thought I think is about revenge. Because there's a lot of talk about this, like the parents especially. Their daughter was brutally raped and murdered in the case of the Robert Willie case, and in the case of Patrick Sonier, both the young man and young woman were killed, and their last moments were in terror as they were brutalized and then killed. And there's natural human sort of inclination is to want revenge for that, to want to see the perpetrator of that act suffer. But the argument's made that one of the most important functions of civilization is to actually institutionalize restraint. And so in the case of, like, if someone does you wrong, rather than go out and lynch them or have a vendetta against them or sort of posse kind of justice, the society imposes a restraint on that behavior, and that's how we are able to live in a peaceful society. And the cases can be made that for the death penalty as well, or as far as punishing the perpetrators of these kinds of violent crimes, that the society can step in where the parents would not be able to restrain themselves from maybe killing the prisoner, but the state could step in and exhibit some restraint. Finally, before I run out of time, there's a couple of quotes that I just really loved. One is Sister Helen's talking about she's under stress. She's actually going to go see one of the victims' families that have invited her to their home. And she says, "I decide to bake an apple pie. When sorrow and loss and conflict are overwhelming, bake a pie." Good advice from Sister Helen Prejean. And finally, I'll close with this quote that is this from the afterword of the audio edition that I listened to. I do not believe it's in this print edition that I have here, but it was in the audio edition. And the quote is from Sister Helen: "There's a principle in the spiritual life I try to follow. Do the deed with integrity. Do it with all the purity you can muster. Do it for its own sake and not because you are seeking some benefit or fruit. As a person of faith, I can state it simply. Do what love and justice demand and leave the fruits of your labors up to God." This is her humility talking. This is her philosophy of the work she does is difficult work. She witnessed these executions firsthand. She was with them right up until the end. She did the hard work with the victims' families. She took a hard look at these crimes and this system and saw it all and approached it with compassion. And I just thought it was beautiful. Okay, I will leave the chat there. And again, I need to read more memoirs. This was so good. My next chat, however, is going to be, let me just call it up real quick. It is going to be Gertrude by Hermann Hesse. I have finished this already, so I will have a chat on this coming up very soon. Until next time, take care.